One.
Ready? Okay, thanks. Good morning and good evening to all the participants from one side to the other of the world. I'm really delighted and honored to chair this important webinar today. My name is Augusto Preta. I'm the chairman of the Italian chapter of the IIC, a founder and CEO of the economic consulting firm IT Media Consulting. Today webinar is the second of the series launched by the IIC national chapters called Competition in Digital Market. The first one was organized by the UK chapter the 29th of April, possibly at the peak of the lockdown period for many countries around the world, and was focused on the future policy for the digital markets. The discussions started with the presentation of the interim market report of the UK Competition Authority, the CMA, which in the meantime, the 2nd of July, has published the final report. The panel discussion involved independent authorities, CMA and Ofcom, and distinguished expert speakers as Tommaso Valletti and Brian Williamson. You can get a report of this event on the IIC website. Now, the second episode of the series today, organized by the IIC Italian chapter, which I'm honored to chair, together with the Italian Communication Authority, AGCOM. It is supposed to continue the discussion, concentrating this time in particular on data. Data, as we pointed out in the presentation of this webinar, have become increasingly important in recent years, to such an extent that it can be considered not just a projection of a person in the digital world, but also an economic resource in all respects, and actually the most important resource in many areas. This creates great opportunities that we have always to bear in mind, in my humble opinion, to avoid to look behind and regret the past, but also growing concern in terms of relationship between innovation and competition. In particular, the role of digital platform in this arena, balancing the protection of consumer in the short run with protecting them in the future through continuing innovation. All these aspects, as you know very well, has attracted an increasing attention on policymakers, regulation and competition authorities. Just in the last year, in the last 12 months, we had the Kramer report from the EU, the ACCC report in Australia. We are eager to hear today Michael Cosgrave about it and the policy evolution in his country, the Fullman report in the UK, and the Stigler report in the US, and the above-mentioned CMI market report just released. Also, Italian authorities were very active in this field of data, and we will listen to them very soon. But just before starting to involve our distinguished speaker, I'm now delighted to give the floor to Angelo Marcello Cardani, the AGCOM president, for a welcome address. I don't think Angelo needs to be presented. His career as an economist, professor at Bocconi University, and as a civil servant, if I might say so, at the European Commission before and AGCOM now, which seems doesn't want to finish yet, speaks for him. So, Angelo, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Augusto. I'm very grateful to you, apart from this kind introduction, to have associated AGCOM to this initiative, which I think is extremely interesting. We'll have the expert opinion of several colleagues from national authorities representing various diverse views of the profession. The main issue of this seminar is data, and being an old economist, I remember that data were used, well, since centuries, if you think of it, to characterize, identify human behavior, and then from the parameters deducted from this analysis, attempts to influence human behavior. There is a magnificent book by Sir Richard Stone, a Nobel laureate, on British empiricists, that shows that already in 1600 data were collected and used to study human behavior. Now, what has changed in the last few years, and changes actually every day, is the ease, the facility with which you can get huge quantities of data, very powerful software, hardware incredibly capable of processing data very, very, very quickly, almost instantaneously. And we, as the TLC industry, well, we provide the structure, the infrastructure on which all these razzmatazz takes place. Now, the use of data is not per se a problem, or better, say that the initial or primary use of big data quantities very seldom creates problem. When my consumption or my purchase behavior, which is already openly disclosed by myself via transaction, is used by my counterpart to answer questions on time series or cross-section behavior, well, we could say nulla quaestio. Is something that I already declared and made public and available. But very often, unfortunately, the data set, including my own data, are used in what is called the secondary fashion or secondary mode, be it because new data are added to the original data set, making it richer, more able to answer questions, or perhaps because other questions are addressed to the same data set. So the more we move away from the issues concerning my one and only contribution, that is the initial transaction, well, the more delicate the operation becomes, to the point that ends up raising the most concerns. That is the socio-political analysis of those data and its natural offspring, the attempt to influence socio-political behavior. Why am I stressing this point? Because public policy, and we all sit on a relatively uncomfortable seats of public policy. Public policy has to balance once more the difficult equilibrium that there is between individual rights, my own rights, I made the transaction, I had the rights, and collective rights, because the many areas where my data could contribute to enhance development, growth, and progress, well, have to be kept in balance with my own will and my own rights. So again, a difficult exercise, but and I believe that all the other topics that derive from the pure data, that is, you know, hate speech or fake news or the rest, are all connected by a very thin red line, which is strike a balance between opposite rights that in principle are acceptable, but whenever move out of a certain proportion become a social danger. I will listen with utmost interest to the discussion. Unfortunately, not for long, because I have to catch a train to Rome. My duties force me, and at one point I'll basically quit without telling anybody, not to disturb further the discussion that I already disturbed a bit too much. Thank you very much, Augusto. Thanks to everybody.
Thank you, Angelo, for your welcome address, and welcome to Gabriella Musco, who joined us just a few minutes ago. As Angelo told us, I mean, there is a big discussion now in place, and AGICOM was very active in this area, developing studies, market analysis, and investigation on many different aspects related to digital communication. As a guardian of pluralism, its range of intervention varies from the relevant market and dominant position analysis, also making in some difference with the antitrust authorities. For the few of you that don't know, which because they are not Italian, know the Italian situation, which is different from the antitrust authorities, I say, which require at least a form of abuse to intervene. Two content and electronic communication aspects related to the implementation of the EU directive, also experimenting some enhanced and innovative forms of self and co-regulation with digital platform in the area of hate speech, protection of minors, and fake news. Antonio Nicita, in particular, as an economist, has developed within and outside the AGICOM a strong attitude to work on a multidisciplinary perspective, from economics to political science to law. This is beneficial to the authority like AGICOM, where all these aspects take a particular relevance in the protection of pluralism, a constitutional good, and also the reason why the AGICOM was established. Antonio Nicita, besides being commissioner of the Italian regulatory authorities, has been an economic professor in many universities, teaching many universities. Before joining the AGICOM, Professor Nicita had a long track record as an advisor for government, public bodies, and private companies, member of the board of directors of Italian Society of Law and Economics, Society for New Institutional Economics, and others. He is also IIC member of the Italy chapter, representing the AGICOM in this respect. His research interests cover industrial organization, law and economics, competition economics, and regulation. He has recently published on the topics of today's discussion, Big Data, a book co-authored with Marco Del Mastro. Antonio, the floor is yours.
Thank you for this very nice and long presentation. This shows that today probably is our officially, not officially, but one of our few days since we have these very long presentations by Augusto. Anyway, I will focus briefly on the main issues that as authority we have tackled in several aspects. I mean, in terms of online pluralism on the one side, in terms of big data analysis on the other, and also in terms of the evolution of the internet economy and also the internet regulation. Actually, the Italian authority is very active both at the BEREC level, which is the European body for telecommunications, but also at the ERGA level, that is the European let me say, platform and association of regulators that is actually analyzing media services and audio media services, but also the evolution of this content on the online side. So what we have done in the past was to try to put together our analysis in order to understand the relationships between pluralism, online pluralism on the one side, online disinformation on the other, but also the evolution of market and competition dynamics. So what we have done through many analyses is to show that there is a strong interdependencies between on the one side, the analysis of pluralism and the evolution of online pluralism and the evolution of competition structure in terms of the platform economy. And that the economic rationale that is actually behind the evolution of the platform economy is the same that is actually affecting online pluralism, hate speech, disinformation strategies, and whatever. Among our works, I would like to mention our investigation on the economics of the internet, an investigation of the platforms economy in Italy, an observatory on disinformation that has been particularly important in the recent weeks on the coronavirus 2019, because we have a sort of new, our personal algorithm in authority, through which we try to measure the amount of disinformation on a specific topic on the total of information in Italy. And also, we have collaborated with the other authorities, the competition authorities and the private authority, on dealing with big data, and we have delivered a joint investigation on big data affecting pluralism, competition, and privacy. And I will touch upon some of these issues because Commissioner Muscolo will focus much more on the competition side. Our analysis actually started with the idea of showing what are the main differences between the standard traditional notion of pluralism and the rationale for regulation, radio TV, and the new notion of online pluralism at what would be eventually a new rationale for regulation in the online field. Now, while historically pluralism has been somehow related to the idea that pluralism was something to be dealt with through interventions on the supply side of the story, which means working on competition in terms of the market for news and market for ideas, while the consumers of information or citizens were simply aimed to be and meant to be perfectly rational in selecting information, in choosing the right information, and in order to take a decision in the economic domain or in the political domain. So this was the theoretical framework through which traditional pluralism has been developed, so that mainly all the authorities, and also the Italian one, has been focused on the idea of promoting pluralism through promoting market competition in terms of diverse source news. We have defined this in Italy as external pluralism, meaning that in order to enhance the market for ideas and pluralism, we should enhance competition on the supply side of the story. We have discovered, however, that the web economy and the web society has completely changed this framework, because while in the traditional framework, the problem was to enhance competition on the supply side, so to face competition and scarcity in access, for instance, to frequencies for radio TV, on the supply side, the issue when we look at the web is completely reversed. Scarcity comes from the demand side, and it is a scarcity of attention. While the main problem in traditional pluralism was to enhance competition in terms of the offer of diverse news, in the web we have an excessive amount of information, so the problem is the reverse one, how to select information since we have this overload of information. This completely changed the rationale, so that the issue is not to have access to the great part of information. The issue is how to select and to make scarcity of our time in order to have the proper attention to the right information. This completely changed the issue of regulation, because the focus now is not on the supply side, but is on the demand side, on the ability of consumers of information to select the proper information, to spend time to select information, to spend time to understand the quality of the information the consumer receives. This somehow has shifted the focus on the rationality of consumers. So while in the traditional framework we assumed that the consumer were perfectly rational in selecting what is good for them, in the new framework we have discovered that consumers have limited rationality, they have limited time to choose, and they are exposed to several forms of biases, of mental biases, of cognitive biases, some like echo chamber biases, confirmation biases, and whatever, status quo biases, so that the problem of selecting the quality of information is not anymore driven by competition issues, but is driven by the way in which consumers receive information and select information. Indeed, this freedom of speech was much more focused on the freedom of listener. So the freedom of each of us of receiving information that is not filtered by algorithms on the one side, and on the other to be able to select and understand what is the quality of information we receive online. So you can see that this is a completely different picture that generates new sort of market failures that are completely different relative to the traditional regulation that we had. So one of the main points that the authorities has pointed out in its research was precisely this: we're in a new context, so that actually just thinking of expanding the old regulation into the new domains is wrong, because the problems are completely different. But on the other side, we still have problems. And the problems precisely come from a failure that comes from the difficulty to select the proper information in a world of overload of information in which people economize on attention. This mechanism of economizing on attention generates two main features. One feature is economizing on attention implies that we spend time just to select what we like, just to select what we want. So just to have to limit the word of search into a word that, as Professor Sunstein said, is very similar to us. It's a sort of daily me environment that just simply mirrors our ideas and our a priori's. On the other, the economizing on attention comes from a new advertising online that platforms are actually experimenting through targeting advertising, and so to select for each of us precisely the information that could have could stimulate a greater attention and then a greater value in terms of advertising. When we combine both these two kinds of economizing of attention features, we come out with an idea of a completely different business, a business model in which you can have efficiency on the advertising side, but a big problem of pluralism on the demand side, because people naturally tend to just look into a world that is very limited in the kind of information they receive or search. But also algorithms are doing that job, profiling and filtering all the information you are expected to like and to search for. This limits actually the number of pluralism, the so-called serendipity, the scope and the extent of diversity we are exposed to. And this is a paradox, because precisely in a world in which we have potentially an enormous amount of information to have access to and to investigate, we are actually limiting through our choices, but also through the algorithmic choices and functioning, we are actually reducing the amount of information we receive and we export. And here comes the main issue, the main open issue in terms of pluralism, but especially here comes an environment that is particularly privileged for the diffusion of disinformation strategies. We don't want to call this kind of information fake news, because we focused several times on the idea of disinformation strategies. And we have done a lot of work with stakeholders in the sectors. We have launched self-regulation and co-regulation measure with 1 year in advance, also relative to the European Commission. But what we have done was to try to understand what kind of self-regulation and co-regulation platforms we're actually introducing. And we have come out with some results. We have come out with some voluntary actions taken by the platforms. But then, and I'm going to conclude, what we have observed was precisely that we have not, as authority, of course, we have not competencies and powers, but also when we start these self-regulation measures, actually we have not even the powers to monitor and to audit and to have inspection on the platforms. So that actually, if you have just a self-regulation as a sort of announced strategy, but there is not a third party independent that is able to control, to understand what's going on, what effectively have been the choices of the platforms, then self-regulation could come to become useless. So at the end of our investigation on big data, we came out with some guidelines and policy suggestions for policymakers. The first was, we don't think that having an authority regulating content is something we should have, because this is very dangerous and exposed to several litigation. But we think that having the powers for a third-party independent authorities to have audit and investigations and inspections powers on the policies that voluntarily the platforms are actually applying, then this could be very useful, because it also allows spreading the knowledge by independent operators of the algorithmic functioning, and also on the effectiveness or mistakes taken by the platforms when they're applying their own rules. On the other side, we believe that this should be coupled with much more transparencies for final users, making them aware, making them aware of the reasons why, and I'm going to conclude, the reasons why they receive some kind of information, how it's possible to have news about the news they received, how it's possible to be informed about the evolution of fact-checking on the news they explored, etc., etc. So we need to have to go through these two main domains of new sort of soft regulations or co-regulation. On the one side, inspection and audit powers. On the other side, working on transparencies and framing for final consumers. We believe, as Italian authority in media and communications, that this would be necessary steps for doing some work in order to tackle the new market failures on pluralism in the web. That's it on my side. Unmute, Augusto, unmute.
I was supposed to be not unmute, so sorry, as the chair. But by the way, I'm sure that your intervention, thanks Antonio, will give the right incentive to make also some specific question, and on this regard, I will ask you participant to push the button where there are questions, so we can get them, and in the second part of this meeting we will try to answer to your question. Now I go to the next speaker. In February 2020, a long investigation on big data lasted around 2 years, if I'm not wrong, conducted jointly by the Italian Competition Authority, the Communication Authority, AGCM, sorry, the Competition Authority, AGCM, and the Communication Authority, AGCOM, and the Data Protection Authority was published. This award stimulates a lot of consideration from many different perspectives. Gabriella Muscolo today will illustrate the ones concerning in particular the subject of our webinar, the role of data in the competition in digital market. For the few who don't know already, I will briefly introduce Gabriella. She has been commissioner at the Italian Competition Authority since 2014, appointed as a judge in 1985. She sat as a specialist section for intellectual property competition law in the District Court of Rome and the Court for Undertakings also in Rome. Commissioner Muscolo has been member of the board of many renowned institutions in Europe, publishing books and papers in Italian and English, including copyright issues, where she is a recognized, well-known expert. Gabriella, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Augusto. Good morning, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank IIC and AGCOM for the invitation to the Italian Competition Authority to take part in this webinar. There is a growing literature examining the impact of the fourth industrial revolution on the economy and society. In particular, at international level, several studies by national competition authorities have analyzed the possible competitive criticalities arising from the digital economy. The Italian Competition Authority, ICA, has of course taken all these studies into account as part of the big data inquiry. However, the added value of this survey is that it addresses big data in a multidisciplinary way. The three authorities, ICA, AGCOM, and the Italian Data Protection Authority, have worked closely together, each providing their expertise and reaching common conclusions. I would like to briefly retrace the stages of inquiry in order to highlight its complexity and the energy-intensive nature. The inquiry was launched, a long inquiry, as Augusto told us. It was launched on 30 May 2017. In June 2018, some interim results were published. A big data interim report adopted by AGCOM and a report, a survey, conducted by the ICA, illustrating the results of a survey on 2,000, a sample of 2,000 consumers, aimed at investigating the propensity of users of online services to allow their data to be used in return for the provision of services, and showing as a result the so-called privacy paradox. On July 10 last year, the main cooperation guidelines on the subject were presented. They have been also translated in English and published on our free website, as well as the policy recommendation shared by the three authorities. Finally, on February 10, the final report was published. It was a long inquiry, not only due to the complexity of the issue, but also to the amount of work involved. The directors and officials of the three authorities held about 40 hearings with companies, industry experts. As I remember, Augusto was also there. With reference to strictly competitive policy objectives, the three authorities highlighted in the recommendations that it is necessary first, pursue the objective of protecting consumer welfare with the aid of antitrust law tools, extending them also to the evaluation of the quality of services, innovation, and fairness. Two, reform the control of mergers in order to increase the effectiveness of the intervention of the competition authorities. 3, facilitate data portability and mobility across different platforms through adoption of open and interoperable standards. 4, strengthen the powers of the ICA and AGCOM to acquire information outside of investigative proceedings and increase the maximum level of sanctions in order to ensure that consumer protection rules have an effective deterrent effect. These are 4, in my opinion, these are 4 crucial points in the debate on the new competition policies, which are of such topical interest and to which the emergence of the digital economy has given impetus. I would like to focus on some of the issues highlighted in the final report in more details, of course, by the point of view of competition. Many markets characterized by these new business models show a high degree of concentration. As it is well known, there are, in fact, veritable online giants. The availability of big data, in addition to investments to develop data analysis and processing capabilities, is, however, only one of the several factors that contribute cumulatively to the high degree of concentration and to the existence of barrier to entry in digital markets. In fact, other factors deriving from the characteristics of multi-sided markets operating within the big data system, such as economies of scale and scope, networks effects, continue to play an important role. A further feature that can significantly affect the competitive process is the existence of switching costs, technical and or economic limitations that can prevent users from changing supplier. This can occur, for example, due to the lack of interoperability among systems of competing operators, generating the so-called lock-in phenomenon, as well as the low tendency of users to change supplier owing to the existence of significant network effects. Moreover, big data may constitute or contribute to raising barriers to entry resulting from other factors, such as network externalities. A few remarks on big data and market power. Due to the cumulative effects of all these factors, markets in the digital economy tend to be concentrated and arrive at the so-called well-known snowball or winner-take-all outcome. In this respect, the survey is particularly innovative when compared with two international studies on the digital economy, as it also raises fundamental questions from a theoretical point of view, questioning basic concepts such as the notion of enterprise itself, the definition of relevant markets, or the assessment of market power. For instance, it is increasingly the case that real market power is perceived to be held by entities which are not yet present in the market and which, according to the current incumbents, would, in a reasonably short time, be able to enter it, destroy the current setup, and quickly reach a position difficult to challenge. To the extent that such an assumption is not entirely unfounded, the market definition needs to be deeply reconciled with. As for market power, and with reference to the most recent economic literature, the inquiry examines in detail the particular importance that vertical and conglomerate integration, which characterizes the main digital operators, assumes in the assessment of market power. These considerations appear to be in line with the conclusions of the analysis conducted in various papers on the digital mentioned, that I have already mentioned, and in particular with the European paper, which explicitly acknowledges the difficulty posed by traditional tools in addressing digital challenges, especially when it comes to ecosystem strategies. Now, a few remarks on data-driven conducts. In the big data sector, conduct potentially relevant to the enforcement of competition and consumer protection may emerge at all stages of the value chain. This includes data collection as well as data analyzing, data management, and processing for the provision of services and the personalization of services. The inquiry in paragraph 533, it's page 88, highlights how the collection and use of personal data may represent a no monetary price paid by the consumers. Privacy, therefore, becomes a qualitative element of the services that, in fact, enters into the evaluations of particular conduct that may integrate possible abuses of dominant position. And examples of such conduct are discussed in the following paragraph 544, is page 107. Data analysis and processing activities, analytics, cloud computing, data storage can favor the implementation of potentially more widespread exclusionary behaviors, leveraging market power, discriminatory behaviors, reducing rivals' data. Although exploitation abuses constitute a residual dimension of traditional antitrust enforcement, their relevance in digital markets appears potentially more extensive, and the inquiry discusses it on page 109. Besides the possibility to exercise market power through activities related to the processing of consumers' personal data, digital operators can exploit their position in several ways. In particular, big digital players may have the ability to charge excessive prices or impose contractual conditions that can be excessively burdensome. The existence of dominant position in the intermediation among several players, moreover, can even raise concerns in relation to only one side of a platform, in particular with reference to the ability of some operators to degrade the quality of service to the detriment of consumers. Finally, price algorithms can facilitate collusive phenomenon. A few last words on the inquiry and mergers. In some cases, the creation of or strengthening of market power in data-driven markets results from operations that may escape merger control under competition law. These operations mainly concern the acquisition by dominant incumbents of potentially disrupted startups, the so-called killer acquisition, especially when the data and the ability to analyze the data are the subject of acquisition. And enabling effective and rigorous merger control in digital markets is a policy objective that must be widely shared, both at national and international level. As mentioned above in the big data guidelines, the three authorities recommend a reform of merger control at national and international level. And in particular, they underline the need, I quote, to be able to fully assess also those mergers below the current thresholds required for prior notification, but which may be capable of restricting important forms of potential competition from their inception, as well as to impose assessment standards more appropriate to the digital challenges, leveraging the criterion of significant impediment to effective competition. A very hipster position. I close here by now, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Gabriella. Thank you also for your perspective on competition side that was at the end not only related to the investigation, but also open up to other important issues like, for example, super merger and other questions that are going on recently very strong. On this regard, as I said before, introducing the next speaker, the Australian Commission was on competition and consumer was one of the most active subject, one of the body involved in the in the publication of reports that included also the ones of CMA, which has just released and very similar and on that. I mean, now, Michael, we are on the other part of the world, so good evening to you, and thanks for joining us for this event. As I said, the activity of the Australian Competition and Consumer Competition doesn't start now, but comes from at least 3 or 4 years of investigation and study on the big data issues. In particular, it's appreciated in the sense of the presence of Michael Cosgrave, because they are already in the new investigation that was published at the same time that the 3 authorities in Italy published their study, and they open up to another investigation into market for the supply of digital advertising services. An interim report I wrote on your site should be ready for the end of the year. Maybe we can see again and you will tell us what are the first assumption, and then next year that will be finished. At the same time, Michael Cosgrave is a very, very senior official at the IIC for the past 20 years. He has worked on economic regulation of other kind of communication and economic sectors like water, transport, and monitoring industry where there is a lack of competition, such as fuel and airports. Michael is a lawyer who has worked both as a barrister and a solicitor across a range of areas in both the private and the public sector. Michael, we are very pleased you joined us, and we look forward to hearing you now.
Thank you, Augusto, and very warm thanks to the Italian chapter of the IIC for the invitation to address today's event. In July last year, I was staying near Torino, enjoying a pleasant Italian summer, and today I'm speaking to you from my home in Melbourne, Australia, during a not very pleasant Australian winter in lockdown from coronavirus. So I know where I'd much rather be today. So much has changed in the last 12 months, but also from the interventions of Gabriella and Antonio, much has also changed in our understanding about the cooperative effort that is required between regulators and, in Australia's case, government actions to address the implication for competitions arising from the rise of the digital platforms. And I've been particularly asked to address you in relation to Australia's digital platform inquiry, but since that time, government has taken a number of decisions that I'll also address in brief. One relates to the inquiry Antonio's talked about, but there is also the development, I think, for the first time in the world, of a mandatory ex-ante code to regulate the bargaining between the digital platforms and news media organisations. So that recognition that has occurred in Italy of the need for a multidisciplinary approach has also occurred in my country with the in the context of the implementation stage of regulation, with the IIC, the competition authority for whom I work, currently developing that mandatory media bargaining code, the Australian Communications and Media Authority, the AGCOM of Australia, providing guidance on a voluntary code of practice on misinformation and news quality to be developed by digital platforms, and the Australian Information Commissioner engaging in a major review of the Privacy Act to reflect the changing circumstances arising from the rise of the digital platforms. And that multi-agency involvement is very different, is a different environment from that that existed a couple of years ago when I was at a IIC annual conference, when much of the early consideration and response was in traditional enforcement activities and in the data protection field, particularly with the enactment of the GDPR in 2018. Here too, the debate continues to develop, with the focus on data being not simply its protection as a fundamental right of the individual, as important as that is, but also the recognition of the right of the individual to use their personal data held by corporations. So whilst I'm here primarily to talk about our study on digital platforms, and this, given we are talking around big data, it's also relevant to notice that a legislated consumer data right has been enacted in Australia for certain industries. That is the ability of consumers to use their personal data collected by companies for a variety of different purposes, including the seeking of new providers. In Australia, that's come into force in relation to banking as recently as the 1st of July of this year. That provides consumers the ability to share their data with alternate providers when requested by the customer. That ability to share data with other potential providers will be extended to a number of other consumer-facing sectors over the next few years. But can I turn to our inquiry, which was a very early intervention, we think, and considered the linkages between issues of market power and competitive harm, the media and advertising, very much related issues, and issues around journalistic content in media that we were particularly directed to consider, given the inquiry arose out of relaxation of media laws in this country. We all recognise the platforms have been major change agents in our economy and have brought benefits in terms of connection of business to consumers, provision of access to information on a scale not previously seen. But we're all very conscious of the concerns, particularly around market power and the many implications of the business models of the platforms. So in 2017, we were directed to examine the impact of platforms on news and journalism, a particular focus. We were given compulsory information powers, which we exercised during the course of our inquiry. Antonio mentioned some recommendations around the ability to have those powers. Those are ones we have. In general, we found, as have more recent market studies, such as the one that Augusto's referred to on a number of occasions by the CMA that was released earlier this week, we found that platforms have become the primary gatekeeper to consumers for business users and advertisers, or for many business users and advertisers, and that they need to capture increasing amounts of user attention and data to continue to grow and support their value. Many of our observations were in relation to media markets and would be well understood by this audience, that many media markets are reliant on the digital platforms, particularly Google and Facebook's, for referrals to their website, that reduction in advertising revenue has flown in part as a consequence of their rise to media businesses, in part because of the increasing proportion of the online advertising market, and that has in turn affected the ability of media entities to invest in journalism, particularly at the local level. We heard complaints from media companies about a range of practices which they have been unable to resolve or discuss with platforms, and again, much of this will be familiar. They included the complaints around digital platforms' failures to address copyright infringement complaints, lack of transparency in the ranking of news content, ranking algorithms that it is said do not appropriately recognise original news content or unfairly treat content which sits behind a paywall, and the potential impacts of so-called Google snippets on traffic to media websites. We also found, as has been mentioned by the Italian authorities, with the decline of more recognised media brands, in particular their editorial and advertising processes, parallels in the rise of more disinformation and fake news, with resultant record low levels of consumer trust in media. So, like our Italian colleagues, we made a number of recommendations to government. We are perhaps slightly more advanced in the sense that the majority of these have now been accepted by the government, and we are in the implementation phase. And Augusto mentioned the Furman review. Many of the same sort of recommendations were made as came out of the Furman review, including a case for ex-ante regulation of the sort I've mentioned, that is also being considered or enacted in Germany and Japan. So we have a role now in the ongoing scrutiny of the activities of platforms until 2025, with a particular focus on their competition implications. We have, as Augusto has mentioned, an ongoing inquiry into aspects of the online advertising markets, and particularly in relation to the ad tech sector. And I'll, in the benefits of time, I'll leave that. But we also recommended a voluntary code to address the bargaining imbalance that exists between the platforms and media companies, with a bargaining code covering the sharing of data, understanding the elements of algorithmic outcomes, and overall value sharing. That recommendation of a voluntary code has now been turned into a requirement to provide a mandatory code in draft by the end of this month, and that will be, we think, a quite groundbreaking piece of work. It requires us to consider quite complex issues around the scope of services to which it will apply, and because it is the first of its kind, issues around the definition of news, the services to which obligations applies, what constitutes use of media content, and most particularly what models for the monetisation and sharing of revenue will be mandated. Will there be bilateral processes or collective processes around bargaining or licensing? These are all factors that we're thinking deeply about at the moment. We're also thinking, as you would expect, around the determination of remuneration factors and how we ascribe value to the bargain, to the enforced bargain between the platforms and media companies. So that is a substantial study that will come out a substantial code that will come out in draft at the end of the month, and I think is well worthy of your attention when it does come to the fore. I'll briefly also mention that we are looking at the AdTech, an AdTech inquiry with a focus on AdTech services and ad agency services. We like many agencies looking at digital advertising technology services, we're finding the market particularly opaque, filled with intermediaries, and requiring deep consideration. I can go into that a little bit more detail if necessary. And I'll just again mention that my counterparts at the Australian Communication and Media Authority are developing a voluntary code to be developed by the platforms. It's on a longer time frame with a report by June next year, but they've set out their, the ACMA have set out expectations and objectives of empowering users, strengthening transparency, and the reduction of impact. And government has made clear, as it has with the bargaining code, its preparedness to move to a mandatory code model if the voluntary code model is not taken up by the digital platforms. So thank you, Augusto. That is my contribution, and again, thank you for the opportunity.
Yes, thanks, Michael. Your job is not finished, because now I want just to pose a couple of questions to all of you before starting. If you have time to question, we have more or less 20 minutes before concluding. So the first one is to all of you, and in some way can be a tricky question, since we have competition authorities and regulatory authorities on the same table, and this in particular related what you said about ex-ante regulation or ex-ante intervention. So you use these tools. Now we have also in Europe with the Digital Service Act promoting in some way the intervention in terms of ex-ante regulation of some particular kind of operators like the online platform. In the past, one of the difference would be if you have a market failure, you can have an ex-ante regulation. Otherwise, you have a case-by-case intervention. On the other side, let's say that was a little bit tricky, because another difference between regulator and competition authorities, the use of ex-ante or ex-post intervention. So, I mean, I would ask all of you this first question: if you think what now prevent, or the other side, as an incentive to use ex-ante regulation in this area, and which comes also to the second point, do you see particular kind of operator, of actors that may require this, as Michael said, concerning some digital platform, in particular the ones that use advertising like Google and Facebook? Or you think there is a general demand of intervention also in terms of ex-ante in this area, because it's a completely the digital market is different, so requires different specific tools for that? There is no specific order. Maybe I can start with Antonio and then going on with all of you. Antonio?
Yes. I just want to focus a bit on what Michael was suggesting in terms of, I mean, what we have now in terms of the perspective of regulation. Because on the one side, we have also opened as the Italian regulator an investigation on the online advertising markets, in which, I mean, what we want to point out and verify is the dynamics of market power there, and try to understand how this is impacting also, I mean, all the media industries, not only the online markets. And it is not clear in this respect what would be the European evolution, because while, I mean, national regulators are I mean, continuing their approach within the regulation that we already have, so within the existing regulation, now there is this proposal by the Commissioner Vestager on creating a Digital Service Act that is actually touching upon all the issues we have touched today. So on the one side, competition issues, advertising issues, but also pluralism, and also pluralism in the particular sense of the regulation made by platforms. So here we have the same issues that, for instance, President Trump raised relative to Section 230 of the Decency Act of the 1996, which means how platforms should behave, whether or not they should have some special responsibility in terms of editorial responsibility or not. So probably here in Europe, we will follow an integrated approach held by the European Commissioner. But it is true that we should have in my view, we should have a convergent regulation. So we should not have just a regulation for platforms in terms of competition, then another regulation in terms of pluralism, another one in terms of big data. We should try to have a comprehensive approach and leave room to the antitrust authority, of course, to do their job in a total autonomous way in terms of market definition and so on and so forth, as Gabriella mentioned, because also the Italian antitrust has started several investigations in this respect, different aspects of platforms, both in terms of consumer protection on the one side, but also in terms of market opening. I know, for instance, they have an ongoing investigation on Amazon. We have done some work in terms of regulation. So, I mean, we are in front of an evolving system which should be convergent in terms of competencies. And of course, then all the authorities should cooperate together, not only in Europe, but also worldwide, because we are tackling the same global actors in different places of the world. So some sort of international coordination is needed. In my view, what we are doing as different authorities in different places in the world, we're actually tackling and studying the same problem, and we have the same awarenesses on the possible dangers, on having a too strong regulation on the one side, but also we somehow see together the same risks of not introducing some sort of new regulation to tackle the new market failures in terms of competition, but also in terms of pluralism. So what I think is that more coordination is needed, but we need to do some step together in a short time.
Okay, thanks, Gabriella.
Thank you, Augusto. Your question is, in my opinion, is not tricky anymore, because the relationship between ex-ante regulation and ex-post enforcement has recently shifted from conflict to synergy, from divergence to convergence. This has been highlighted in the conclusions of digital expert panel by the Commission, and also in the guidelines of of Italian big data inquiry. Indeed, the ex-ante regulation of digital platforms will address market imbalances to ensure the consumers have the widest choice and that the single market for digital services remains competitive and open to innovation. As we all know, for this purpose, the European Commission is considering additional general rules for all platforms of a certain scale, such as a rule on self-preferencing, tailored regulatory obligation for specific gatekeepers, no personal data access obligation, specific requirements regarding personal data portability and interoperability. Therefore, one of the main issues of this new regulation could be to determine which will be the gatekeepers to apply these new rules.
Okay, Michael?
Thank you, Augusta. And of course, I'm going to agree with my fellow competition regulator in many of the things she says. And of course, I'm very cognizant of that it is a competition regulator advocating for ex-ante regulation. One who's we of course have ourselves involved ourselves in ex-post investigations and activity in this area. We were very cognizant, and I haven't talked around the market power analysis because, as Antonio says, it's a common problem around the world, and most agencies who have examined these issues have had little difficulty finding market power in a range of markets, be it search, be it advertising markets, etc., etc. What we found that because whilst imbalance of bargaining power exists in many industries, we felt that in a traditional two-sided market like media markets, and the necessity for media players to deal with the platforms, that the imbalance was of such a nature that ex-ante regulation was warranted. But I agree with Gabriella that we've moved from a world where people saw these as alternatives to synergistic or complementary strategies.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. In the meantime, we received some questions. I'm very proud that some of them are already answered by my questions, so maybe I pose the right question to the speaker. And so I will give the opportunity to answer only to the last two that I'm here in the monitor. The first one is something that is regarding how would you imagine a possible property right on data? Do you think it could be a solution in order to counterbalance digital platform market power? I mean, yes. Gabriella, you are the...
Augusto, I think that Antonio should intervene first because it's one of the topic he deals with in his book, and I will intervene later.
Okay, it's up to you, Antonio. If Antonio is still on the phone, no, yes. So do you want to read again? Do you want I read again the question, Antonio?
Yes, please, because I can't hear.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. How would you imagine a possible property right on data? Do you think it could be a solution in order to counterbalance digital platform market power?
You know, this is one very important question. I thank Gabriella for that. You know,
you have 3 minutes, no more.
Yes. Here we have actually two main approaches. One is an approach, let me say, more antitrust side, more economic, and the other one is a little bit much more based on a traditional data protection view. The point is that data is already an economic asset and is already subject to economic exchange. So somehow there is a flow of propertization of data, even if this is not a process that is made explicit in the market with explicit property rights. And so my view is that since looking at the common law approach and Calabresi-Melamed approach, we have that when we have a property right, we can have 3 ways of protecting property rights: with property rules, with liability rules, and with inalienability rules. So we can have the same partitioning of rules of protection of rights, so that somehow giving people explicit private property rights on the data could help people to construct upon property rights, but also to inhibit any exchange of property rights or economic use of property rights in the future. So I think this is a promising way to tackle the economic issues of property rights, and so to couple together propertization with that personal data protection. The idea of data portability goes in this way, that is explicited in the general data protection in Europe, goes towards this way, and also I think that propertization will allow coordination of property rights among many people, because each of us with his single property rights has not any bargaining power against the big platforms. But if new intermediaries do emerge that can somehow collect private property rights of all the people, of a great part of people, and manage vis-a-vis the big platforms through private property rights, then this could be one way to counterbalance the bargaining power of big platforms when they use private property rights. So I think that propertization is an important way to analyze this issue. And so I thank Gabriella for mentioning that. I've wrote about that in the book with Marco Del Mastro.
Yeah, I think this is also a sort of a consumer protection issue that both antitrust and the Australian authorities are dealing with. Maybe I'm wrong, but as it was not just an economic question. But Gabriella, please.
Thank you, Augusto, and thank you, Antonio, for these comments. In the debate on big data, the dilemma on regulation is on open access on the one side and proprietization on the other side. It's just to simplify, the German position, the Max Planck position on the first side, and the common law position on the other. And about proprietization, and let me say that, like Antonio, I'm much more on the second side of the latter. And the debate on proprietization is also divided in 2 different streams. The one in favor of the general ownership, and the one in favor of intellectual property. And about intellectual property, you can distinguish several options protecting which IPR is more suitable to the protection of big data. Copyright, not really trademark, patent, trade secret that is not really an IPR, but it's close to the regime of IPR. I am in these times I'm studying more the question related to protection of big data by patents. And I think that the general ownership is more related to personal data and the phase of collection. And IPRs are more suited to protection of data in the data mining, data analyzing phase. So I have no time in 3 minutes to go deeper in details, and in the comparison between the US and European EPO approach to the registration of patents, patents on inventions as business models of big data analyzing.
Michael?
I will be very short, Augusta. We thought for about 1 minute about general data portability right, and realised all of the complexities that have been raised, and said that is an issue for another time. I did raise in my intervention, though, that and this is where it is always important to talk about the nature of the right, and a general data portability right is very different from having the ability to access your own information held by another company on your behalf. So in Australia, we have moved towards what we call a consumer data right, but it is a much more limited right. It is an important right. It is a very important right that recognises the personal nature of the data that corporations collect upon an individual's behalf. But some of the concepts around general data portability and collecting together data, they require considerable thought.
So
Thank
now
you.
we have 3 minutes for one answer, one question to answer. I mean, there was also other question regarding ex-ante sensor facility, something that we already answered in my question. So the last one, I see Gabriella, maybe if she wants to add something, that's fine. I mean, but there is also one we probably has to do on the regime that we call a co-regulation or something like that, which is something that has to do with the digital platform, of course, and already Michael and Antonio expressed their view, but they want to be more that if, for example, we can consider a player like Facebook, a media company, so maybe that will be easier to apply this kind of rule in co-regulation, since now this company are just subject to a self-regulation. So that could be an answer of the question posed by also by Antonio in his first speech. And so since Gabriella was interested to go more in depth on the essential facility market failure doctrine, if she wants to add something, just as an answer to the question posed by the audience. Thanks. 1 minute each.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Augusto. A very short reply to the question on the essential facility doctrine, because the literature on big data is also faced this issue. However, the majority of opinions is not in favor of applying the essential facility doctrine to the big data ecosystem for the essential reason that data are replicable. So one of the conditions for the application of the doctrine that are very strict is missing.
Okay, thanks. Michael, and then we conclude with
I really don't know what co-regulatory approach would apply in this sector. Perhaps the closest I've heard is the model that was talked about earlier by Antonio. So I do not have a model in my mind that I feel can deal with the market power issues here. I leave it there.
Okay.
Well, my answer is yes, yes, and no, in the sense that as I mentioned earlier, the new issues, the new also economic issues that we have with big tech and big platforms have to do with this tremendous and dramatic change on the demand side. So this is true that indeed real barriers to entry are not given by access to data per se, but they are much more related to exit costs of the consumers that are in the platform. So that it's something that if we just want to have a sort of theoretical paradigm, probably we have not to do with the essential facility doctrine, but much more with the old tradition and theories of aftermarkets in antitrust, in a sense, no? I mean, I would focus on, I think my personal view is that antitrust law, with the exception of what Gabriella said, and that explicitly refers to the merger policy and the instruments for merger decisions in antitrust, I think antitrust, they have all the instruments to tackle this world. The other point is whether or not we want to introduce some regulation for the big tech, and in this sense, what also, I mean, very soft regulation, but in this sense, this means some ex-ante rules for which we have to select dimension of platforms, like we have done in the past for telecommunication operators. So, for instance, looking at the minimum dimension for being regulated, and for instance, minimum dimension of in a given territorial area, and linking this dimension precisely to the network effect on the demand side that may introduce some exit costs for users towards alternative platforms, and then using this notion of exit cost as a new barrier to entry, a sort of new negative externality for which you need to have some sort of regulation, precisely because there is not possibility of having market disciplines on the demand side through exit options. But these are all ideas that are actually investigated also at the European level in this moment.
Thanks, Antonio. Now we are going to conclude. Maybe we will need the sort of fake claps as it used now in the stadium, just to say thanks to the speaker that joined us. As I said at the beginning, I also put in my page on LinkedIn that could be also a memorable day for me and for Antonio, for myself, because it's my birthday. So that's why I had the honor to share.
Okay, so we will sing now. So we will sing for you "Happy Birthday" all together now. I have not my piano here, but I cannot move.
Thanks for the thoughts. And the second one
Happy birthday for your 51 years.
Yeah, but yes, 35. And this is also in France they will do instead of you. By the way, the second one is maybe, as I understood, that would be an election today in Senate. Antonio has spent quite a lot of time in the AGCOM in the last year. This wouldn't be the last meeting he will join, probably, but maybe if he wants to say something to the people that I believe that the attention of the Italian wouldn't be today to this section. So you will see probably more foreign people attending the meeting than the Italian ones. But if you want to say something to conclude.
Thank you very much. Let me thank IIC also for having organized a lot of interesting work in these years, and all the people with whom we have worked and from whom we have learned a lot. And I'm sure that new people that will come to the authority will be able to continue and to enhance the work that you have done in these years. And that's it. Thank you.
At least we look forward to people that can speak English. That will be the minimum guarantee for having next meeting with the IIC. But by the way, thanks a lot very much.
Thank you.
Have a very nice day. Bye bye.
Ciao.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Michael. Ciao
Bye.
Gabriella.
Thank you. Bye, Antonio.
Ciao Augusto.
Grazie.
Ciao.